Shh. Hi everyone. So I'm gonna just go through some of the stuff that we didn't get a chance to talk about together yesterday about the Enlightenment. And I'm going to try to super simplify this in a way that it hits all the points that the AP wants you to know. The stuff about the Enlightenment that has a direct impact on the political revolutions, which are kind of like the physical manifestation of the Enlightenment era. So we reviewed the basic definition of the Enlightenment, and I highlighted that the big concepts, the big takeaways I want you to have about the Enlightenment are the concepts of the social contract, the concept of legitimate rule, like who has the legitimate right to rule, and the concept of natural rights. We talked about the philosophes, which are coming from the French philosophical tradition. There are a lot of French intellectuals who are opining about natural liberties, self-governance, reason. We talked about deism. And of course, this is coming from France because France is living under arguably the most absolutist government in Europe. So of course, there's a kind of intellectual rebellion against divine right monarchy in France. So a little point of view work on our French intellectuals there. We went over Hobbes and Locke as many historians look at them as the beginning of Enlightenment, at least this era of Enlightenment, because their disagreement over the English Civil War and whether or not the parliamentarians had the right to execute Charles I is kind of the beginning of modern political theory as we know it today. Hobbes representing the more conservative side of that argument and being a defender of absolute monarchy, and Locke disagreeing with Hobbes and believing that humans are capable of self-rule because humans are born tabula rasa. And as a result, if you provide humans good education, then they can handle and actually are best suited for a form of self-governance. So we went over Hobbes and how his version of the social contract, this idea of balancing security and civil liberties, is an extreme one because according to someone like Hobbes, he believes that stability, my dog is really cranky today, so she might bark a lot, so I'm sorry. Pen. He believes that stability is of utmost importance, and essentially that citizens of a state should be willing to give up anything for that stability, and that the ends always justifies the means. So if the state takes away all of your civil liberties, as long as it creates stability, then the state is right to do so. Thomas Hobbes believed that humans are evil by nature, and so the only way to have a civil society is by giving all power to an absolute monarch. He believed that that absolute monarch was divined to rule by God, and thus they are different from other humans, so they aren't subject to that same evil nature. So he supported all the divine right monarchies and authoritarian versions of them. Whereas John Locke, as we discussed, when he reflected on the execution of Charles I, he believed that the parliamentarians were correct to do so because Charles I was negligent in his rule and abusive in his power. He believed that humans are born tabula rasa or blank slate, as I said, and thus have potential for goodness and for responsibility and self-rule. He does not believe in divine right and is one of the earliest people to write about the concept of natural rights, life, liberty, and property in his case. Thomas Jefferson later changes it to pursuit of happiness, as the concept of property is a complicated one in early American history. Pen, you gotta stop. Sorry. Here we have kind of the beginnings of these discussions, and they begin to ripple throughout Europe and then eventually make their way to the colonies of North America. So I wanted to share some notable quotes from some other major philosophers. We're not doing any big readings just for sake of time, but if you are curious, I can always suggest some to you. So some of the big philosophers that the AP wants you to know and that I think are really useful to know include Voltaire. Voltaire is a French philosopher who is often kind of talked about as like the king of free speech. He's all about free speech. And we can see that in this first famous quote of his. I may disagree with what you have to say, but I shall defend to the death your right to say it. Um, the first two quotes I chose to encapsulate some of his big ideas are very straightforward. However, Voltaire often wrote satire. And so some of his other works sometimes are totally misinterpreted because that's the danger of satire. If people aren't sharp enough to see that it's satire, they may disbelieve it to be true. And then the point is lost on people. But yeah, the last quote is satire. But the first two here highlight some of his big causes and interests. So the first being free speech. The second is his condemnation of the use of kind of arresting all people, right, even without due cause, as well as the use of the death penalty that was used pretty liberally by the French absolutists. So he says, it is better to risk saving a guilty man than to condemn an innocent one. And considering the modern state of death penalty and how often once DNA evidence is finally admissible to a case, how often people are exonerated on death row, he makes an interesting point about how often innocent people fall victim to the quote-unquote criminal justice system, even in the modern day. And he's calling this out in like the 1700s. So we're beginning to talk about things like, the idea of individual liberties and the idea that everybody has the right to life. So all of these French philosophers agreed with Locke that there are three natural rights: life, liberty, and everyone has the right to have some semblance of property that should never be compromised in order to get more security. And so Voltaire believes that even guilty people who commit crime, whatever that crime might be, have the right to life. And that's like the utmost right that all people have. And so it is more important to preserve that than to get quote unquote justice, whatever that might look like. Because to kill an innocent person is one of the most egregious violations of the natural right. And then his last quote is a little cheeky one. He says, it is forbidden to kill. Therefore, all murderers are punished unless they kill in large numbers and to the sound of trumpets. He was very critical of the military and the overuse of the military in this time period as per his perspective. So he's calling out the hypocrisy of states where they authorize murder through war, but condemn it in private life. Next up, we have JeanJacques Rousseau, who is super, super influential. He was originally an artist who just is reacting to the world around him. And his most famous work is The Social Contract. And so JeanJacques Rousseau is really just questioning everything. And I would love to talk more to you guys about some of his work and his ideas. One of his most famous quotes from The Social Contract is, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. And that's kind of the starting point for this whole concept of his version of the social contract, because he doesn't coin the term, and I want to make you very clear about that. People have been talking about this concept of social contract for a long period of time, but in his version of it, he begins to really look at the origins of the concept of the social contract and the concept of society in general. And in this quote, he is indicating that by living in a society, we are inherently unfree. That the constraints of living with other people make us less free than when we were not living in societies. And I should say, not living in civilizations. He's kind of in agreement with people who look at hunter-gatherer societies of having more freedom, because he, in his book, highlights that the moment that someone said, this is mine, that a piece of property is theirs, that's when certain forms of violence set in. That's when more constraints set in. That's when inequality begins. And so he is looking at the world through this particular lens and assessing how human behavior has changed and trying to maximize freedom within an inherently unfree space, right? The space of quote unquote civil society. So he believes that really there's no way to be fully free so as long as we are living in a society. But he believes that people can be more free than they currently are, considering how strict many absolutist governments are. He, looking at another quote, he does not believe that might makes right. He says, force does not constitute right. Obedience is due only to legitimate powers. And again, we're bringing this idea of who has the legitimate right to rule. He is a supporter of people like Voltaire and Locke, believing that the general populace should have the greatest say in their governance. And so he talks about concepts like general will, and again, the idea of social contract. But in his view, like Locke, there are certain elements that should never be compromised. He is in agreement that life, liberty, and everyone having some measure of access to property is essential to maintaining freedoms. They should never be given up in order to get more stability, right, or safety. And to bring up the concept of property and why that was seen as so important, even though many of these thinkers and revolutionaries are going to either drop that concept or be kind of hypocritical in their application of it, the idea is that property, since so much property was the hands of so few noble people or monarchs or like the Catholic Church, that the only way for people to be free is if they had the ability to know that they will always have a home, to know that they will always have some way to support themselves and not be fully dependent on like a monarch or some sort of noble landlord. So, like I said, these are some of his concepts. So he talks a lot about the general will, and that he believes that any legitimate society will represent the general will of the citizen, and that in obeying the laws of the state, each citizen is pursuing their own interest because that should allow them to maintain their natural rights. So by general will, this doesn't mean majority rule. This is almost, it's kind of like difficult to say in a concise way, but the concept of general will is that there is a form of consensus that can be met, so long as that consensus does not impinge upon anybody's natural rights, and that consensus should drive the laws of the land. So that's kind of the concept of general will. And by consensus, someone like Rousseau did believe that certain groups that would be considered minorities should be considered within that. However, in the application of these ideas, when we look at the revolutions, especially in places like the American Revolution, many of those people who are the architects of the American government, they don't include all people in the general will, right? So as we move forward, we need to see the application of these things and watch how much Enlightenment ideals actually play out in virtuous ways, non-virtuous ways, in equal ways or unequal ways. And again, social contract, right? We've already talked about this a bunch, but it's this implied agreement, and we should note that again too, right? This unspoken agreement between a nation and its people that you're going to give up some of your rights to the government or to civil society to receive more security and to preserve social order. So we can chat about this together, but we I'm just going to leave that. We don't have full freedoms, especially in the United States, right? There are certain things that we choose to give up or at least imply. If we talk about this more generally, in almost every civil society, for example, we give up some of our rights that we might not think of them as like rights. But for example, as a human of free will, I can use my body however I choose. However, in a society, I have chosen to give up some of those rights. So for example, as a person with a body, I could use that body for ill will, right? I could use that body for murder, right? For assault. that is something that technically, right, I am born free to do if I did not live in a society, right? But since I am born in a society, I'm born in this particular government, and this government has says it is illegal to use your body to hurt other people, I've effectively given up that right. But in exchange for giving up that right, I receive the right to live, right? I receive the right that most likely other people won't use their bodies to hurt me. So, in accordance with Locke and Rousseau's version of the social contract, giving up my right to hurt someone is best because I receive a greater benefit of knowing that in that society I'm less likely to be hurt than in a society where that right is not implied, if that makes sense. Okay, moving on. All right, next up is Baron de Montesquieu. Baron de Montesquieu is a philosopher that wrote a lot about the structure of government and the importance of separations of power and checks and balances. And also kind of talked about what laws are worth writing. So he wrote a lot about the separation of power, branches of government, and as I said, he was a big supporter mostly of constitutional monarchies, but also of any other kind of like just democratic representation in general. So I really like these quotes. I think they give great insight into a lot of his work. And one of his big works is like on law. So he writes, "There's no nation so powerful as the one that obeys its laws, not from principles of fear and reason, but from passion." And so, here he's even going against one of the main concepts of the Enlightenment, which is the idea of reason. And he's saying that people should be enthusiastic about their governments. People shouldn't be fearful of their government. People shouldn't be reasoned to death from their government. But if you incorporate people and their needs and their passions into the government itself, through democratic means especially, and through participation, through legitimate rule, then you will get an enthusiastic populace who will be happy to participate in civil society. So that is the most effective form of government. The other quote, "Useless laws weaken the necessary laws." He warns against like over legislating things, by micromanaging the populace. And that if everything has a law, that people will be able to prioritize like which are the most important laws to follow. That at some point laws become noise and they don't help to create structure. So, he warranted against, like I said, that over legislation, like too big of government, essentially, and wanted people to have some more autonomy, especially in their personal lives, in order for the government to make clear which are the most important structures to follow. We also have Cesar Beccaria, who is another philosopher who specifically is writing about human rights, essentially. So in his book On Crime and Punishment, one of his famous quotes is, "Crimes are more effectually prevented by the certainty rather than the severity of punishment." And he was very much against cruel and unusual punishment, against torture, generally against the death penalty, as he believed that they were not effective, which, kind of data backs that up, that preventing laws are always more effective in creating safety than punishing. And again, the quote talking about the certainty of punishment, right? So for things to be clear and measured and dependable are better ways to create safety within environments than to throw everybody in jail and give everybody the death penalty, especially the idea that punishment should fit the crime, that you shouldn't be thrown in jail. Like the same two people shouldn't end up in the same cell, one who stole bread to feed their family and someone else who murdered someone, right? That's saying that those crimes are of equal value when that's simply not the case. And again, he was very much against torture and anything that could be considered cruel and unusual punishment, which included long jail sentences for most crimes, especially what we might consider like misdemeanors or lower level crimes. And especially he spoke out against crimes of poverty, right? When people commit crimes because they are simply poor and they're trying to meet some of their basic needs. that to punish those is useless because they're going to continue to happen because you have not solved the poverty issue. That if people have what they need, they won't commit crime, right? So he's writing about that in the 1700s. And here we are. This is still kind of a modern day debate and topic. Denis Diderot is another interesting person. So his biggest contribution is he coordinated the writing of the first encyclopedia. And so what he didn't write it all, but he gathered a bunch of people. It was actually pretty cool. He gathered a bunch of educated people and he would ask them all to submit articles. And he would publish them alphabetically, right? So you needed people to write articles on what's an apple, right? What's astronomy, right? What's zoology, all of that, and began to publish them in these compendiums that were relatively cheap. Sometimes they would have patrons who would buy a bunch and then kind of distribute them to people who couldn't afford them. He was a super enemy of the state. The French absolutists hated Denis Diderot. He was jailed a bunch. The encyclopedia was a banned book because it represented the democratization of education. I really liked what the Diderot did, and of course, because I'm a teacher. But the whole idea behind this is that the French monarchy was shaking in their boots because absolutist and authoritarian politicians do not want an educated populace. An educated populace knows their rights. An educated populace is able to demand more. It behooves politicians, especially authoritarian ones, to have people who don't know what's going on, right? So that they can say, trust me. You only need to trust me, right? Just trust that I know what to do. So fearing that an educated populace would lead to revolution, Denis Diderot was, like I said, jailed and the books were banned, although of course they do persist. So another example of the things going on in the Enlightenment. And then lastly, we need to recognize that we have people such as Mary Wollstonecraft of the English tradition who begin to call out the limits of the Enlightenment because we've mostly been looking at men. And in her great work, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, which has some limitations by the modern day, but for its time was calling out the hypocrisy of enlightenment, where everyone's talking about everyone has natural rights, the right to life, liberty, and property, and yet women are consistently left out of those conversations, of those movements, which, especially in the case of the French philosophes, is particularly upsetting to people like Wollstonecraft, or we'll learn later about a French woman named Olive de Gouges, who is like, y'all, like women were literally holding the spaces for these philosophes to meet. Many women would hold these like parties, which were called salons, as women were, especially aristocratic women, were expected to entertain people, to host parties for people to gather and enjoy themselves. And so these classic salons eventually became spaces for philosophers to work, to write together, to collaborate. And women were often a part of those conversations, but their works were never given due. So in The Vindication of Rights of Women, she points out, I think what is an obvious fact today, that women are not naturally inferior, which many people were arguing, but that women's lack of participation in public life and production in the education sphere is due to the fact that they have not had the opportunity to be educated, to have a seat at the table, and that provided those opportunities, you'd see that women are as capable and sometimes as incapable as men. It's kind of all based on natural talents and, again, access. So she's, providing that feedback. And I just kind of included here that her daughter is Mary Shelley. And so I don't know if you've ever read Frankenstein, but, little fun fact stuff right there. All right. So those are the big, what am I saying here? Big philosophers and philosophers that I want you to know. So I do want to intro how this all leads to the revolutions. And I also want to introduce you to the term the Atlantic revolutions. The AP and all world historians look at all the big revolutions of the late 17 and early 1800s as one political event. And they all are around the Atlantic basin, the Atlantic Ocean. And we'll see that they're very interwoven. And so they're often called the Atlantic revolutions, right? So in order, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, the South American revolutions, we'll see are all very integrated. So I want us to think of them as one event, but of course we will need to know the particulars of each individual event. The other thing I want to point out, because we're about to see a bunch of revolutions throughout the world, as communication technologies are improving, as people are becoming more educated, and also as the life for lower class people is just getting exponentially worse during this era due to economic disparities, economic policies, political policies, and stuff like that. So I do want you to look for the difference between a rebellion and a revolution. Because rebellions happen all the time, right? But revolution brings change. So how does a rebellion turn into a revolution? So this is what I'm sharing with you is based off of a book called Anatomy of Revolution, which is a really cool book that looks at some common traits of all revolutions. So what I want you to look for is things such as, is there class cooperation? Because, especially in this moment in history, the lower classes can't go alone. They can't go it alone. They don't have resources. In this time period especially, they do not have resources. So what we see is that when lower classes are going against their government or whatnot alone, it's probably just a rebellion. It's going to disrupt things, but it's probably not going to bring about major change. Because again, they don't have the resources. They don't have access to weapons or money. But if you start to see some members of the upper classes, maybe the nobility, but even just like what we consider like the middle class, any class that has access to resources, if they begin to cooperate with the lower classes, we're probably on our way to revolution. Class cooperation leads to revolution. We also need to look for the military. If the military begins to fracture, and some of the military begins to join the rebellion, to support the rebellion, then probably they're on their way to revolution, right? The way the military swings is often a big indicator of if change is on the way. The biggest indicator is what women are doing. The moment women join rebellions, we're on our way to revolution. Women historically, because of gendered roles and expectations, they are taking care of the home sphere. And when the home sphere gets so bad that women go against societal expectations, such as kind of keeping to the private sphere, they break with that and start to march in the streets, it is on, right? The moment you anger mom, it's on, it's over, right? So we need to be looking for what women are doing. It doesn't mean that women are going to enjoy all the fruits of revolution, unfortunately. But if women are joining and leading rebellions, we're probably on our way to revolution. So in the Atlantic revolutions, what I want us to be looking for are some common causes, but obviously like I said, the particulars as well. So for each of the Atlantic revolutions, the Enlightenment has some role in it, right? As some inspirational role. But we're going to be seeing that there are different levels of influence that Enlightenment thought has. We also need to look for the role of mercantilism, because as we know, mercantilism limited the economic development and self-determination of the people in the colonies. So we need to look for how much that frustration at having the mother countries make economic decisions will influence people to rebel against their governments. The other thing we're going to look for is how all those Atlantic revolutions are interconnected, whether it's they are financing each other, whether it's they are sending troops to fight in each other's revolutions, but they are very interconnected. So Part of the work that you're going to do today is starting to brainstorm what you know about the American Revolution. I'm not teaching the American Revolution. You should know it. As a discussion, I'm going to have you brainstorm the causes and effects of the American Revolution as you remember it, and also what role foreign powers played in the American Revolution. All right, that's it. Goodbye.